Hello, my name is Abraham Castillo Flores, also known as Aullidos Panteoneros. That translates as graveyard howls. I'm a film programmer, an expert of Mexican horror cinema, and a long-life devotee of freaky cinema from all over the world. Welcome to the special features of La Llorona, brought to you by the Indicator series. I presume you have all heard about La Llorona. Of course you have, otherwise you would not be watching this Blu-ray. But who is La Llorona? La Llorona is Mexico's national horror cinema deity, but also a legend that has been with us from the very beginning. Her myth is a perfect vehicle to understand and explore the ideas of the feminine gone berserk, the fear of the bad mother, and the idea of the woman that has been wronged. According to historian Enrique Ortiz, the first manifestations of La Llorona is actually Cihuacoatl, a serpent goddess that was the protector of women that had died during childbirth, and she was a patron saint of human sacrifice and war. Her appearance marks one of the dark omens that would foreshadow the arrival of the conquistadores. It is said that the nightly lament of Cihuacoatl was, "Oh my children, where will I take you?" That dark promise became reality, and after the conquistadores came, the myth changed. There were reports of a spectral woman, all dressed in white, walking through the streets of Mexico City and screaming, "Ay, mis hijos, oh my children." But why is La Llorona crying? According to most versions, it starts with an indigenous woman that falls in love with a Spanish conquistador. They have a child together. For this, her family rejected her. She was ostracized from the community. At some point, the conquistador threatens to leave. Some stories say that he was going to go with another woman, a European woman. She says, "If you leave, I will kill the child and then I will kill myself." The conquistador goes ahead and leaves her. She takes the child, walks into a lake, drowns the kid, and then herself, only to come back as a ghost and wail. Somehow, this idea got mixed with La Malinche. Who was La Malinche? La Malinche was the wife of Hernán Cortés, the head conquistador. She was a slave that was given to him, and she became a key figure in the conquest of Mexico. Why? Because she had a knack, an ability for languages, and she was the first one to bridge between the indigenous population and the conquistadores. The film, the 1933 film, uses this idea as the origin story for La Llorona, and I'm sure that this origin story got carried on because of the film. We should also remember that although La Llorona is a Mexican myth, there are echoes of this all over the world. For example, the murderous mother Medea, the Irish Banshee and its shriek, the song of Lorelei, the Danish mermaid, and the Obume, a yokai that represents mothers that had died during childbirth, which brings us full circle with Cihuacoatl. So as you can see, La Llorona, although very Mexican, is actually a myth that transcends Mexico and has echoes all over the world. 1933 is the year that La Llorona is shot and released in Mexico City. But what was happening in 1933 in Mexico in cinema history? That year, 21 films were shot. The year before, there were only 6. You can see Mexico was booming in terms of cinema. But why did this happen? Let's backtrack. There was a huge revolution in filmmaking a few years before. The advent of sound changed everything. Hollywood used to produce movies that could go all over the world and just, break into any market. But suddenly the advent of sound started making barriers. In order to, still gain its worldwide hold, Hollywood came with the idea of the Hispanic Hollywood film, so they could still attract the Spanish market. For this, they would hire actors from Mexico, Cuba, Argentina, Spain, and put them in their films. The results were a mixed bag. For example, we have something like Dracula, which was shot in the morning with Bela Lugosi in English, and at nighttime it was shot as Dracula with Carlos Villarreal. And the results were not so good box office wise. Local audiences, everybody who spoke Spanish, was not so keen on this idea of mixing accents. And also there was even words that were problematic on one region versus the other. And also the star power, that was important. People wanted to watch Bela Lugosi, not Carlos Villarias, for example. This experiment dwindled, but there was an upside. All of the talent before the camera and behind it that got trained in this system eventually had to go back to their countries of origin. But they brought back a know-how and a technique that before they didn't have, and it helped them develop their national film industries. This was the case in Mexico. People, for example, like Chano Urueta, Emilio Fernandez, Gabriel Figueroa, Joselito Rodriguez, they came back and business started booming. For example, in 1931 we have Santa, the first Mexican film with synchronicous sound, and it was a big success. And it opened the doors for producers to start putting money and for filmmakers to suddenly go wild and try to tell our stories for our audiences. Flash forward, 1933, business is booming. They realize that there's a market, so it's time, and it's during this year that La Llorona gets unleashed. This is directed by Ramón Peón, a Hollywood-trained director known as the man with the black blood cells. Why? Because his love for cinema was so big that it was said that he had celluloid in his bloodstream. Ramón Peón was born in Cuba in 1897. He studied to be a chemist, and he soon left that work to go into show business. He worked as a magician, as a dancer, and an entertainer. He then left to the US, where he worked first in a laboratory, and he found out all the secrets that made cinema happen. After that, he got hired to be a news cameraman. That training got him eventually a job in Hollywood, where he co-directed a couple of feature films. In 1920, with all this knowledge, he goes back to Cuba to establish his long-life dream, to make the Cuban film industry. From 1920 to 1930, he shot many films. Of this period, we have The Virgin of Charity, which is considered the key film of the silent period in Cuba. But in 1931, Peón leaves Cuba to go to Mexico, where cinema business was thriving. He arrives, and with his Hollywood training, he gets a job really fast. He gets to be the first assistant director in Santa, the first Mexican film to embrace sound, which was a huge hit. In this film, he proved to producers that he was really good with schedules and budgets. Soon after, all the producers wanted to hire him as an assistant director, but of course he wanted to direct. His first chance comes in 1933 with La Llorona, which a chance that he embraces. Producers love him. Why? Because he's really good at keeping films on budget and on schedule. He shoots tons of films in the next period. He has 12 films from 1933 to 1937. In this period, he gives his first starring role to Jorge Negrete, sex symbol and big singer, who becomes the #1 entertainment of all Latin America. Ramón Peón was so strict about this idea of not losing time that he would start the day whistling with a whistle in hand and chasing people to move up and to start work. He would do the same thing after lunch. And some of his peers did not like this. They compared him to a foreman. He died in Puerto Rico in 1971, but we will always remember him as the man that chased cinema with all his might and all his energy. The film takes place in 3 different timelines: the present, 1933, the colonial times, and the conquest. The conquest is kind of interesting because it's very theatrical and very sparse. It's very evident that they used most of their budget in the colonial times and the present. In the colonial times, there's this lavish and expensive clothes. They had satin, brocade, and silk. And for example, they have tons of extras in the wedding sequence, and everybody's lavishly clothed. And they had access to the Metropolitan Cathedral of Mexico. There was a film critic that always joked that every extra in Mexico worked in that scene. Also evident in their budget decision was the recreation of an alleyway where there was the sword fight sequence was shot. They recreated that in a whole studio, and it included not only the alleyway but also the facade and the balcony of Doña Ana's house. In a newspaper article, they tell the story of an accident that happened while shooting. In the scene where Doña Ana stabs herself on the balcony of that set, she was so entranced with the moment that when she stabs herself, she went back thinking that she would go from the balcony into the room that was behind her. She forgot there was no room, it was a set, and she would have plunged to her death. Fortunately, her dress, the very expensive dress, got caught on the structure that was holding the set together, and that saved her. Can you imagine how happy the producers were with the money spent on that dress? When you make a Llorona film, one of the most important elements is her cry. And in this production, the producers were really, frantic because whatever they tried was not working. It was either laughable or just unconvincing. After a long search, they found Carlos Villespinal, the leader of a marionette troupe that made a marionette version of La Llorona. And he was able to make this incredible wail, which is the one that you hear in the film. It turns out that Carlos Villespinal had learned how to make that wail from the Rosete Aranda family, which was the most important marionette troupe and the ones who first developed this technique, along with things that changed the world of marionettes in Mexico. They had actually made the Llorona thing back in 1830. Imagine that, from 1830 to 1933. Somehow, Mr. Carlos Villespinal did not get a screen credit. His marionettes eventually made it onto film. In 1950, in the film Rosario Castro by Roberto Gabaldon, but most importantly and memorably, in the film Macario in 1960, where there is this crazy dream sequence with marionette skeletons running around. This is a pillar moment in Mexican fantasy cinema. From 1933 to 2022, there have been 12 feature films that feature La Llorona in Mexico. There's been countless short films around her myth. Each of these films offers variation on the visual treatment and on the legend, but all of them offer a window in how this myth has been perceived by Mexicans throughout time, but it also says a lot about the big contradictions within our own national identity. Of all these films, I would like to highlight a few. We have The Curse of La Llorona by Rafael Valedón. This is an incredible film that brings black magic and a gothic ambience in the realm of Mario Bava and Hammer into the Llorona legend. In the 21st century, the La Llorona was reawakened from a 30-year slumber back into cinema screens by Lorena Villarreal, who's the first woman to direct a genre feature film in Mexico in the 21st century. A few years later, in 2006, Rigoberto Castañeda made Kilometer 31, which had a big spin on the mythos, but it also raised our national self-esteem in terms of visual effects and makeup effects. After that, the genre possibilities in Mexico really widened. Finally, in 2011, there was an animated feature about La Llorona, The Legend of La Llorona, which brought La Llorona to children. And it's funny because most of us learn about La Llorona when we're kids. They tell us the story before we go to bed, so we refrain to do something stupid. Horror stories to inflict discipline. And somehow this came with this film. It was a very moving film, but also very scary. And I think it reawakened something in the perceptions of this. And I'm hoping that it also made an inception in all these kids. So the Llorona myth keeps on going, and we have more and more stories as the years go by. I should also mention that there's been many Llorona films made in the US, but of those, I'd rather not even talk. Of the other adaptations around the world, there is one that is, I think, important to mention. 2019 film La Llorona by Jairo Bustamante, which reinvented the mythos, but it did in order to talk about a national tragedy and genocide. This is very important. Although La Llorona is a very Mexican myth, it transcends us. And I find it fascinating that other countries are using that legend that is so well known and adapting it to its own culture and its own history to talk about pain. The 1933 version of La Llorona, it's an interesting experience. For example, all the transitions between the different timelines when they're like reading the book and they have these crazy wipes. It's like, no, totally calling attention to itself. I love those moments. Also, there's like these crazy dolly shots around all the indigenous people and the conquistadores that are very stylized, and they're just gorgeous. There's even an Aztec warrior with the tiger head around him, which is that was the first time I saw that on a Mexican film, and I think it's quite fantastic. Also, there's another element which brings me to these like very Mexican things. The ring. There's this ring that supposedly carries on if you want to be part of the cult or of the people that are following the Llorona curse. So the people that are the bloodline of Cortés get killed, and they're wearing that ring. That, and there's the moment where they're about to kill the child, and behind you can see this big statue, stone statue. That's Huatlicue, one of our earth goddesses, both destroyer and creator. And even though she's in the background, and in the film credits, there's really some good close-ups of her at the beginning. I love that all these elements that were brought down by the Spanish in the conquest, and they tried to erase them from our culture, they keep coming back. And it's these instances, I remember being small and being very intrigued by them. It's the kind of thing that you want to ask more, and they tell you the story about the conquest. And there's really not that much information they give you about the Aztec culture, but seeing it in a film, it makes you start, wondering, asking questions, and dreaming about it. And I think that's a fantastic film, and I love that in this film that is there. And as I said, I think the passion of Ramón Peón, even though maybe the film is not perfect and it's not one of the jewels of cinema, it has all these stylistic flourishes and moments where you can see a man that was obsessed with telling the story. And I find it also amazing that a legend that has been with us since our pre-Hispanic days makes it into the 21st century in this new Blu-ray that you're now watching. So these are stories that keep transcending time over and over again. They don't go away, and I find that fascinating. Cinema as our memory, cinema as a way of not losing touch with our legends, our stories.